All right. Hello, everyone. This is Mallory Flowers on behalf of Jennifer Schaus and Associates. We are coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Welcome to our webinar Wednesday series, and thank you all for joining us today. Our webinars are held every Wednesday in 2018 at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, and our speakers range from accountants to attorneys and other industry professionals. The full schedule for the rest of the year is on our website and underneath the webinar tab. In the interest of time, we do not take questions. Our speaker's contact info is posted on the last slide, so if you have any questions, please contact the speaker directly. The recordings are on our website underneath the archived webinar tab, as well as on our YouTube channel. And this is just a quick blurb about us. Jennifer Schaus and Associates is based in downtown Washington, D.C., and we help both product and service companies with federal contracting. Our clients are domestic and foreign, defense contractors, and civilians. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles, including the GSA schedule. We can also help you with proposal writing and post-award contract administration. More information about our services and upcoming events can be found on our website. So let's go ahead and dig into today's presentation, which is Procurement Integrity Act, What Info Can You Have and When? And Mark Snyderman is our speaker today. You can learn more about his background on this slide. Thank you, Mark, for joining us today, and I'm going to hand the floor over to you now.
Thank you, Mallory. I'd like to thank Jennifer Schaus and Associates for the opportunity to speak with you today. We'll be diving into a really important compliance topic for the Procurement Integrity Act. There's two sections to this discussions, and we'll just jump right in. So next slide, please. So the Procurement Integrity Act is found in the Federal Acquisition Regulations, Section 3.104. It is the law that embodies the concepts of the authority for contracting officers, fairness and the fair opportunity to compete, competition, full and open competition, sole source. So PIA is the short term for Procurement Integrity Act. Really governs the behavior for both government and for contractors. Next slide, please. So why is this so important to know? Like anything in government contracting, let's start with the bad. A violation of PIA is pretty nasty stuff, right? It imposes civil and criminal penalties for violations that are up to $50,000 and 5 years in prison for government employees. And for contractors, it could be up to $500,000 and 5 years in prison. You could be looking at suspension or debarment of the company, or even just cancellation of the procurement, which could be highly detrimental to the client, at the government, and could cause lots of agita for you with your customers. So next slide, please. So like I said, there's two main components here. We'll spend most of this afternoon talking about the ban on disclosing procurement information, but we'll also briefly touch on the hiring rules for government employees, since both topics are covered in the PIA, and we should have time to address both for you here today. Next. So what is the ban on disclosing procurement information? The Procurement Integrity Act prohibits disclosure of, and we'll use the real terms here from the Act so that, and we'll define these out for you so you can see exactly what it is you should have and when. PIA prohibits disclosure of contractor, bid, or proposal information and source selection information. And who does the ban apply to? Well, the ban applies not only to current federal employees, but former federal employees. It applies to contractor employees advising the government on a procurement. So say you're sitting on a source selection board. It also applies to contractor employees who advise the government on a procurement but are no longer doing so. So it covers the gamut of contract employees and government employees when they're working on procurements. Next slide. So what's the problem if you had competitive information? It's really a balancing scale, right? So the entire procurement system is set to try to enforce balance and fairness. So if Company A has a source selection plan in advance of a procurement, they have a distinct advantage over competitor one, and they tip the scales. So the Procurement Integrity Act aims to balance the scales and ensure that no contractor has more information than someone else before a procurement is out on the street. Next slide. So the ban is on disclosing procurement information, and individuals are prohibited from knowingly, and that's in quotes, lawyers love to use quotes around things, from knowingly obtaining or disclosing contract or bid or proposal information or source selection information before a contract is awarded to a person other than a person authorized to receive such information. So what does that mean? If you have contract or bid or proposal information or source selection information, you got to ask yourself, what do I have and why, if you have it before a contract has been awarded. So let's define contract or bid or proposal information and source selection information on the next slide. So contract or bid or proposal information, it's exactly what you probably, you probably know this one pretty good if you're a contractor, right? It's cost or pricing data. It's your indirect costs and direct labor rates, not only yours, but also your subs, proprietary information, and it's any information you mark as CPBI. And that's actually a really good tip for those of you writing proposals. You ought to be marking your data correctly and mark it, and always use disclaimers on your proposals and mark your data as such. Even mark the box that you put it in when you send it to the government. Next slide. Source selection information. That's bid prices, proposed costs, source selection plans. So the source selection plans are the actual plans that the government uses as to how it's going to make its selection in advance of a procurement. Technical evaluation plans, evaluations of proposals, proposal rankings, or any other information that could be marked as SSI under the FAR. Next slide. So what's prohibited? So you're prohibited from paying or promising something of value to a government official to obtain CPBI or SSI to get favorable treatment. That's pretty obvious. That's basically bribery. It's prohibited to intentionally view, hear, or take confidential government information without proper authorization. So if a source selection plan is just sitting on a desk when you're walking by, which it shouldn't be, but it could be, if you intentionally go over and flip it open and read through it, you violated the Procurement Integrity Act. Offering or promising employment or a business opportunity to a government official or his or her family members to obtain restricted government information or favorable treatment. Or obtaining information about a competitor's price, costs, or bidding plans during a procurement period from a non-public source. So, you can use public sources to find or FOIA information about competitors and procurements, but you cannot do it by a non-public source, right? You can't hack their systems, can't talk to their employees and obtain information illegally. This is all prohibited under the PIA. Next slide. So what else is prohibited? Inducing a competitor not to bid on a particular procurement. So that's basically stopping another competitor from going ahead or convincing them that it's not a good idea for them to bid it. And any action, this is sort of the catch-all, right? Any action that the company cannot do directly cannot be done directly through the use of a consultant, agent, or other party. So basically, if you can't do it directly, don't try to do it indirectly. Since it's World Cup time, and hopefully some of you are watching, and not watching right now, but watching normally. And FIFA is obviously, we've all heard all the stories about FIFA throughout the years. They violated not only Procurement Integrity Act, they violated fraud and abuse. Pretty much you name the gamut of it, they've done it. Essentially, they have bribed with hundreds of millions of dollars over the years to ensure that certain countries didn't bid on having the World Cup there. Next slide, please. So what does PIA not apply to? It doesn't apply to disclosure or receipt of information by an authorized personnel. So if the person's authorized to disclose it or receive it, that's okay, right? Makes sense, right? If you disclose your own information and you're a contractor, right? You put the information out there. Now PIA doesn't apply. If a procurement's been canceled before award, then PIA doesn't apply. So it becomes public and you can disclose things. Or it doesn't apply to meetings between agency officials and potential offerors, assuming that there's no unauthorized disclosure at that meeting. So you can meet with the government and have discussions on, such as, you might be asked to come in and do a verbal discussion over your proposal and talk about actual things that are in the proposal. That's not an unauthorized disclosure. Next slide. It doesn't apply to, it doesn't restrict sharing of information with Congress, the GAO, or a federal agency or an IG. Certainly, they have the power to come through and ask for information related to a procurement, and you'll have to give it. It doesn't limit a requirement, sanction, contract penalty, or remedy established under another law or regulation, and it doesn't apply to non-competitive procurements. So that's important. So if you're dealing in a sole selection environment, PIA is not applicable. Next slide. So the best way for me to explain these to you, we just went over a lot of law, hopefully not too quickly that you can comprehend it. But let's look at some hypotheticals, and this will help solidify what exactly the PIA applies to, when you should have information and when you shouldn't. So I gave you a couple examples here. So we'll run through the example and then discuss whether or not it's a violation or not. So Ray is a Department of Defense employee and a member of the team that was writing a statement of work for a sole source contract. He believes he could shorten the process, so he sends the sole source contractor an advance copy of the SOW to get his back channel comments on it. Did Ray violate the Procurement Integrity Act? Next slide. No, he didn't violate the Procurement Integrity Act here because the sole source contract is non-competitive and therefore PIA doesn't apply. Next slide. How about this one? Subcontractor helps prepare a proposal with a prime contractor under a teaming agreement. The subcontractor then submits its own proposal for a follow-on contract and basically uses the entire proposal from the prime. So they take all the prime's proprietary information. Is this a violation of the Procurement Integrity Act? Next slide. This one's tricky. It's not a PIA violation. The prime contractor voluntarily shared its information with the subcontractor. Now, although it's not a violation of Procurement Integrity Act, it certainly could be a violation of a teaming agreement or NDA between the subcontractor and the prime. So that's just a side tip to you to make sure that when if you're a contractor and you're putting out proposals, make sure that your TAs and NDAs are tight and you're obtaining those. This was an actual case, and it's a DynCorp case, and that's the citation to it if you wanted to look it up. Next slide. So the Department of Defense inadvertently disclosed proprietary information from an incumbent contractor in the RFP documents and on the Department of Defense web pages. Disclosures contained in incumbent's historical contract information. It then immediately removed the proprietary information. Was this a violation? Next slide. No violation because the information released did not relate to the agency procurement. So because it was old information, it didn't relate to the actual procurement that was here. And the protester, obviously the SNK Aerospace protested this when their information had been released, and the GAO found that the protester couldn't show that the release was done knowingly. So again, we're looking back to the statute and seeing it has to be a knowing release. It can't just be an inadvertent release as it was here. Next slide. There's an interesting case that was a couple years ago. So the Air Force contracting officer inadvertently sent the contractor's point of contact an email with source selection sensitive attachments, right? So it was an email that went to the contractor and it had source selection information attached to it. The contractor's POC forwarded it to a bunch of employees, didn't look at it, just forwarded it along because it came from the Air Force, forwarded it to the rest of the team that was working on the proposal, right? Pretty standard. Air Force tried to recall the message about 10 minutes after it sent it. Next slide. The contractor took 2 full days to quarantine that email. So they saw that the proposal, the source selection information was attached to an email, went to multiple recipients that had been working on the proposal. They continued to work on the proposal and didn't quarantine that email for 2 days. Was this a violation? Next slide. Yes, it certainly was. The Air Force suspension and debarment office concluded the contractor's conduct was in violation of the Procurement Integrity Act. The contractor was suspended for its conduct after disclosure. If you don't know what suspension is in the government contracting world, it's essentially economic jail. You're suspended from bidding any more contracts. You can finish out work, but you're suspended from bidding anything new. And it can be agency-wide or across agencies. The suspension was only lifted after the contractor could show that it implemented an ethics program and had much better procedures in place to identify when it had information it wasn't supposed to have. So exactly what we're talking about today, what do you have and when to have it. This contractor had a bunch of information it shouldn't have had, and it didn't do the right thing when it got it. So this is a good case to think about in terms of the whole discussion today. Next slide. So let's turn to the hiring rules. These are we'll just do a few slides here on the hiring rules. They're pretty straightforward overall, but they are part of the Procurement Integrity Act. So I thought it would be good to add these in, even though it's not directly related to the information you're holding, but they are definitely interrelated in terms of your compliance and your requirements to provide an ethical and responsible contract as an organization. So the hiring rules basically say that a government employee who is personally and substantially participating in a federal agency procurement that is in excess of the simplified acquisition threshold. It used to be 150,000. It recently changed to 250,000. Sorry, I didn't update my slide. In excess of the simplified acquisition threshold, and who contacts or is contacted by a bidder or offer in that procurement regarding possible non-federal employment. So essentially, what are we saying here? You're a contractor. You're bidding a job. Putting in a proposal. There's a government employee working that particular procurement. They have significant participation in putting the procurement together, and you contact them to say, hey, you want to come work for me? Next slide. What happens? That contact must immediately be reported to the Government Ethics Office by the government employee, and the government employee has to reject the employment opportunity or disqualify him or herself from further participation in the procurement. Any offer is no longer a bidder, or all discussions about employment have been terminated. So this is pretty serious stuff for the government person. So you can really put your customer in a bind and also throw the procurement into a real tizzy if you violate this rule. Next slide. So what are the restrictions on government employees? Some people call these revolving door restrictions. You may have heard that term. It's a 1-year ban on a government official from accepting compensation from a prime contractor that has been awarded a competitive or sole source contract as an employee, officer, director, or consultant after that official, so after the government person has served either as the procuring contracting officer, a source selection authority, a member of the source selection evaluation board, or a chief of financial or technical evaluation team. Next slide. The ban also includes program managers, deputy program managers, or administrative ACOs, or administrative contracting officers, as long as the official who personally made decisions on awarding contracts, subcontracts, modifications, task or delivery orders, they established overhead or other rates, they paid or settled claims. So it's essentially anyone that applies, and it only applies, this is critical, right? It only applies to contracts in excess of $10 million. So if you're dealing in sole source contracts that are smaller dollars, or not even sole source, but competitive, this ban, the government ban, does not apply, right? So it only applies to larger contracts over 10 million, and it's essentially most employees, government employees that are working on the procurement and throughout the process of issuing task orders and mods and overseeing that contract. Next slide. So again, we'll do a couple quick hypotheticals because it helps drive home the concept. So Linda is the deputy program manager over a major technical engineering services project. The project was a sole source contract to XYZ for technical engineering services, and it was in excess of $10 million. So 2 months after assuming the position, Linda left the government and is then offered a job working for XYZ in the same general area. So the same conceptual, same part of the company for XYZ that was working on this contract. Does the Procurement Integrity Act prevent Linda from taking the job? Next slide. Linda is barred from accepting compensation from XYZ company due to the 1-year ban. Next slide. So the $12 million competitive award is made to ABC Company on January 10th of 2017. The week before the award, Sharon is named a member of the sole source selection board on the procurement. After award to ABC, Sharon becomes the contracts administrator and makes decisions to award several task orders to ABC Company for the government. She gets in a fight with her boss and she leaves federal service and goes to ABC Company on June 5th of the same year. Is this a violation? Next slide. Yes, Sharon can accept compensation from ABC Company because she awarded task orders to the company as well as was on the source selection board. Next slide. So what happens if you have a violation? What happens if you have information that you're not supposed to have? So if you think that information has been improperly disclosed to you and you want to know if others have the same information, ask. Right? The first thing to do is find out who has this information and who else has it. Do you have something that you shouldn't have? People around you may not know the rules. It's up to you to ask questions. Be aware if the source of information doesn't want to be revealed. Right? If you get handed a statement of work or a spec from a government customer, and they don't want you to know, they don't want to say that they gave it to you or they slid it into your bag, make sure you know what you have and how and why. Next slide. So what do you do if you get it? Stop reading it, stop listening, quarantine it, right? So what did we learn from the one case with the Air Force that we talked about earlier? They didn't quarantine the email in time, right? They got the information, they spread it around, and they waited 2 full days before they did anything about it, which means the chances that someone had actually read through the source selection information and were just going to use it in developing the proposal was high. So had they quarantined it and handled it quickly, they might have been able to avoid the violation or at least avoid suspension. So what's the first thing you need to do? If you get information you shouldn't have or you're unsure, contact your supervisor. Or if you have in-house counsel, call your in-house counsel. Maybe your contracts department, your company should have a policy in place in its handbook for how to deal with violations and how to deal with information that you have and what to do with it. You may need to think about mandatory disclosure to the government. And like I said before, it's really important to mark your own information as proprietary and ensure that you have the proper TAs and NDAs in place when you're doing bid and proposal work. Next slide. So that's all I had for today. I appreciate your time. I'll hand it back to Mallory. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. That was a lot of great information, and thank you for sharing your time with us today, and thank you for everybody who joined us. If you have any questions for Mark, please contact him directly with the contact information you see on your screen. Next week, we are covering GSA pricing analysis at 12 o'clock and then price to win at 12:30. And this concludes our webinar. Thank you, everybody.